Welcome to episode 153 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm talking with Jennifer Bennis about why schools overwork and undervalue teachers from a historical perspective, and how we can use this knowledge to help us interrupt patterns and advocate for change. Visit truthforteachers.com to get the transcript, the links to the resources that Jen recommends, and to share your thoughts in the comments. If you're a longtime or a regular listener, I would love for you to also share your thoughts by leaving a review on iTunes. Thanks so much for helping to spread the word about this show. So today, you are in for a treat. You are going to get the edu history lesson that you never knew you needed. We talk a lot about what a shame it is that teachers are so poorly paid and how unrealistic the demands are, but we don't talk nearly as much about how things got to be this way. We need to understand the societal norms, the institutional structures, gender dynamics, all of these different things that got us to where we're at today in order to be able to influence them moving forward. Jennifer Bennis is one of the most knowledgeable people that I know on this topic. I follow her on Twitter. She's at Jen, Jenn, Bennis, Binis. And I'm just fascinated by her ability to notice patterns and to disrupt them. She's also the curator of Ed History 101. That's on Twitter, and it's also a podcast on education history. She doesn't regularly update the podcast. There hasn't been a new episode in quite some time, actually, but I still recommend going back and listening to some of those older episodes because they provide a really entertaining and informative perspective on the history of our schools. So this is one of the few interviews I've done without a tightly defined outcome and structured set of questions. When it comes to history buffs, I like to just give them the opportunity to craft the story in whatever way it flows naturally. So I started by asking the question, why do schools overwork and undervalue teachers from a historical perspective? And we just took things from there. Let's jump in.
So I think the exciting thing about your question and kind of the piece where we want to we start thinking about gender and education and history and all that stuff is kind of looking at the common school era. And I think one of the things that it's helpful for teachers to understand is that the notion of femininity was always deeply entrenched in who gets to be a teacher. There was a very conscious effort to make teaching a profession that was acceptable for America's young women, mostly white, parenthetical statement. So at the rise of the common school movement, when America was saying, okay, East Coast, let's have a common school. Let's send all of our boys and some of our girls to school. They need to be in a place that's safe and warm. Who better to do that than women? So we have to keep in mind that a lot of what we inherited has its deep roots in this notion of white femininity. And so when we struggle against some of the things that happen in the present day, it can help us to understand where those roots are, back in the notion that teaching is what women do before they get married and before they have kids. It's a safe, welcoming profession for America's white women.
So this is a time in history when women were not allowed to work out of the home, right? What time period is this?
So if we think of like the 1830s, so right before the Civil War, and it's always you always have to have little asterisks on these conversations. It's worth stressing that in most Southern states, teaching Black or enslaved children to read was illegal. In multiple states, including in the Northeast, Indigenous children were given Christian educations, oftentimes with or without their parents' consent. So that's one of the reasons, one of the kind of battles I fight on Twitter is around this notion of the factory model, where a large number of people like to say, well, America's stuck in the factory model. And the challenge is when we talk about the factory model, you're narrowing the history of education to just what happened to white children. We have to talk about what happened to, enslaved children, what happened to Indigenous children, what happened to, Asian children when they first arrived on the West Coast. So in the 1830s, before the Civil War, there is some statistic I saw once, it's something like upwards of 80% of all women in Massachusetts in the 1840s and 50s had been a teacher at one time.
Wow.
Because it was what women did before they got married and have children. So you'd you'd get your grammar school graduation degree. You perhaps go to a normal school. They were just starting to emerge. You teach, you'd meet your husband, you'd quit your teaching job, which meant the turnover was incredibly high.
Mm-hmm. And this was always a job that was designed for white women, because this is the first time really where white children are leaving the home during the day and they're in someone else's care. And that was thought to be something that a woman would do best.
Yeah,
is that
exactly.
Right?
Yep. So the arguments were made. And some of the people making these arguments were women themselves. Some of the early advocates. So this is when I'll start the plugging that I like to do, of probably the primer, for lack of a better word, of teacher history education is a new book by Dana Goldstein called The Teacher Wars. History of America's most embattled profession. And she starts back in the 1830s, 1840s with the rise of the common school movement and talks about the transition away from dame schools towards, grammar schools, and how they had to get so many teachers. So yeah, it was a relatively new phenomenon that we would gather all of our community's children in one building, put one person in charge, and have them take care of the child all day. Well, not all day.
How long was school in those days?
It was very, very varied. It depended dramatically on the community. One thing to keep in mind is the nature of bodily functions. A school superintendent in New York State in the 1850s did a huge survey of all the schools in the state. And there were something like 200,000 one-room schoolhouses at its peak. And only 40% of them had a dedicated spot, of a dedicated washroom or a dedicated, outhouse. So a lot of the Roman schoolhouses were close enough to children's homes where they would just walk home. So they'd maybe have 3, maybe 4 hours of schooling, go home and then come back. And granted, some did have, outhouses and whatnot, but it wasn't the norm. School wasn't a full day. And sessions were typically about 6 to 8 weeks long throughout the entire year. The longest sessions were usually in the summer and the winter, but it wasn't a full day. It didn't become really truly a full day the way we see it now for 180 days until the early 1900s.
How are these teachers compensated?
Oh, poorly. Incredibly poorly. So there's New York State has always had a long history. New York State was one of the first Department of Education in the country, and it was big on documentation. And so the state superintendent for education would hire these schoolmen, they were called schoolmen, to go out and do inventories of school districts. And they would collect salaries and, outhouses and textbooks and all these data. And in one report, the person doing the review, the man doing the review, noted that the teacher remuneration was fair because the male teacher was earning like $27 a session, where the female teacher was earning $13. And that was utterly reasonable because, of course, he had a family to support and she didn't. It didn't matter if he was married or not. But men would often earn up to twice as much as women teachers would.
So a man could become a teacher and he could be married and he could have children, but not women.
Sure. And it was utterly transitory for men. It wasn't really seen as a profession for men. Usually, not always, there were some exceptions to the rule, but often if a community had a male teacher, he was on his way to something else. He was a lawyer who couldn't get a job in a law firm. He wanted to work in the government, but wanted to save money before moving. It was a transitory thing typically for men. Not always, there's always exceptions, but yeah, it was women's work.
And how interesting that even today we find that men teachers often don't stay in the classroom as long as women do. They're immediately seen as being leaders. Move them to assistant principal, move them into a principal, move into superintendent.
Absolutely. And that phenomenon has a name. It's called the Glass Escalator. It came out of a sociologist named Christine Williams, and she noticed that in female-dominated professions, cisgender white men tend to move very quickly, exactly like what you said. And so when we think about what teachers can do, I'm a big proponent in naming patterns. If we notice that men are always asked to lead the committee, to be the department chairs, if men are always the ones speaking up, it's hard and awkward and uncomfortable. But even just saying, I notice that in our school, we have 15 leadership positions and 12 of them are our male teachers, or all of our male teachers have leadership positions in our community. what are the unintended consequences of that? Just having that kind of conversation saying, are we accidentally falling into these patterns?
It's just interesting listening to you talk about all this because it sounds almost like you're describing modern schools in so many ways. We've come so far, and yet there's a lot of things that are still the same.
Yeah.
How is what's happening today in our schools still being impacted by gender dynamics and by this history of the profession?
Well, there's you identified the schoolman phenomenon that, that men often get promoted or move more quickly up through the ranks than women do. There's also a whole bunch tied up in classroom decorations. The whole phenomenon of the Insta teacher or the Pinterest ready classroom. That is deeply entrenched with the notion of gender norms. One of the transitions that had to happen to make school a place where women could work, where families wouldn't have to worry if their daughter was working, is it had to be a beautiful place. Because in order for it to be a respectable place, it had to be aesthetically pleasing. And so a great deal went into advocating that women teachers decorated their schoolroom. And I've got a couple pieces and I'm happy to share some links to that I've written on this. And teachers were praised for having, aesthetically pleasing decorations, for, painting the walls, making them pleasing for their children. That's an incredibly hard habit to break because human nature is to want to make things look pretty. But when teachers participate in the Pinterest classroom phenomenons or sharing, Insta-ready classrooms or putting forth a picture of a beautiful classroom without detailing, I spent this much money, this was donated, it took me 97 labor hours to get all of this done, and, my parents and my in-laws and my kids helped, we're doing a disservice. So another way to kind of disrupt patterns or to advocate for change is be absolutely transparent about how much unpaid labor goes into making a beautiful classroom.
Right. So it's not that, you're wrong if you do it, but we don't want to make it seem like this is just the norm and these classrooms just magically come together with no expense and no effort on the part of the teacher, because sometimes it does look effortless.
Oh yeah, exactly. So there's nothing wrong with doing it. Where we run into the problems is if we act as if it is, like you said, the norm, or that it just happens overnight. And so we kind of asked the question about what we can do. Another thing that we can do is physically share teacher evaluations with each other. The write-ups that your admins write, the actual language, share it with each other, especially if you're a mixed gendered teaching team or faculty. So as an example of that, a good friend of mine, he's been teaching for 20 years now. His classroom walls are bare. It's a mess. But he's been teaching for 20 years. His kids love him. It's government. He has the bare minimum requirements on the wall so we can, visual aids for teaching, American government. So 20 years of this. His next door neighbor is a second year teacher. She's young. She has a whole bunch of student loan debt. She can't afford to decorate her classroom. When they compared teacher evals, my friend noticed that nothing was said about his classroom decorations, but his neighbor, a brand new teacher, something was said about how the classroom wasn't very welcoming and it wasn't very warm. And fortunately, my friend had the gravitas and the expertise and the background to go to the principal and say, this is not fair. It is not fair that you wrote her up for classroom decorations and not me. And had a tough conversation with the admin about unintended consequences of kind of gender-based lenses.
Right, because normally teachers aren't sharing evaluations. You really don't know. I don't think I've ever knew what any of my colleagues had said on their evaluation, unless it was something that really made them mad. And then maybe they talked about it a little bit, but it's not something where we're really having conversations about.
Yeah, because we'll often talk about the way it makes us feel, or we'll talk about the general sentiment, but even down to adjectives. There's been some work around, there's a couple different researchers who do work around feminism in teacher evaluation, and they taking a feminist lens to teacher evaluation. It's Critical Feminism and Critical Education is one of my kind of favorite books about it. And they talk about how female teachers are referred to as gentle and kind and sweet, where male teachers have control of their discipline, understand their content. They tend to focus on different things and evaluations. And the only way to uncover that is to physically share with a colleague, hey, what words were used to describe you? What words you describe me? And kind of unpack that. But the challenge is the same holds true for colleagues, teachers of color. If you're a white teacher, share your language with a teacher of color and just kind of look for those patterns. But the challenge is, in many cases, the demographic pool, you can go 13 years of education in America and not have a single Black teacher. Mm-hmm. So you could be the only Black teacher in an entire school district. So we're not to a place where that's a natural part of sharing because of how dominated the profession is by white women, which,
was by design.
Yeah, it's by design. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So a small step is just to start to share language between the dominant demographic of a community and the non-dominant. So yes, it's by design for white women, but at the same time, there's still some gender norms that kind of come back and shoot teachers in the foot, as it were.
Right. And one of the interesting things that comes up sometimes when I'm talking about these kinds of things with teachers is people will say, oh, it's not just women teachers who are impacted by this. All teachers are doing this, especially when we're talking about like unpaid labor. Oh, it's not just expected of women. And what I think the important point to understand is that, anyone who's in the classroom is going to be impacted by the gender expectation, by the expectations for women. Gender dynamics are going to impact all teachers because that's who the norms of teaching were developed for. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Even down to how we handle large group discussions. The act of raising your hand, it's a norm that is very Eurocentric, very white centric. To talk one at a time, to raise your hand, to wait for an adult to acknowledge you. It's a very school specific behavior, which by virtue of the dominating demographic is a white norm. So yeah, definitely.
So one of the expectations that is still being placed on teachers today to have this warm, welcoming, decorated classroom, that is sort of a holdover from the earliest days of the profession. What are some other things that we're still experiencing the lingering effects of?
The nature of, classroom discussions, things about walking single file, things about how we even refer to each other, going by Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so. All of the things are inherited norms related to having an adult in the classroom in charge of a group of students within the hierarchical structure. And it's not to say it's wrong or bad to have your students call you, Miss Watson or, Miss Bennis. Let's stop and take a moment and consider, why am I having my students call me by my last name? Well, if it's a way to show respect as defined by whom? And the exciting thing about these conversations is there's never really a right answer. It's not like you have to start using only your first name and, et cetera, et cetera. But it's about saying, okay, wait, why are we doing this? Mm-hmm. And kind of tilting our heads a bit and say, hey, maybe we could come at this a different way. And when we do that, we're more likely to create inclusive classrooms where every child feels as if the classroom community was created for them, with them, not to them.
Do you think it's fair to say that the job of being a teacher was designed to be underpaid and undervalued from the beginning?
In a certain extent, yes. I'll defer to Goldstein's book. The challenge is the catch-22. There is the underpaid because female teachers were cheaper than male teachers, but at the other time, it was also an elevated position. Women couldn't go into the clergy. It wasn't possible for women to be as a layperson. It was either you were a nun or you couldn't be as a layperson, go out and proselytize. That was just a door that was closed to women. But if you went and became a classroom, you were proselytizing to this group of children. You could show them the light of an education. So on one hand, yes, underpaid and devalued. On the other hand, there's the martyr teacher syndrome. Mm-hmm. And it's funny that you and I are talking on the first day of, or last, knock on wood, who can say, the LA teacher strike. Because what's going to happen is a lot of people are going to write thought pieces about how, these teachers are putting their needs in front of the kids, or, their job is to be in front of the classroom. That's playing into this norm of the martyr teacher. that what teachers do is so special that they should set aside all of their earthly needs and just focus on what the children need. Which, as soon as you start to peel that back, you realize what a catch-22 that is for a grown woman to say, okay, you have your needs, but you're here for the kids. It's a terrible message to send to children that teaching is such that once you become a teacher, you lose your right for self-advocacy. And that's a very terrible message to send. So there's a number of kind of things that are hold over. And one of the things we don't often think about is just the physical demands that teaching can have. And that's tied up with the martyr syndrome and how teachers have a disproportionate number of urinary tract infections and kidney infections. And that's a function of how schools are designed and how teachers can't just step out when they have to use the restroom because of the fact they're often the only adult there. And because of how schools are designed, we've created these kind of systems where it just seems like the norm. Well, of course, you're going to go 4 hours without using the restroom because, that's how long you have until you have a planning period. But who would complain about that because teachers aren't expected to complain?
Right. And that's a whole nother issue there. This idea that, as a woman, when you are in charge of children, you should do that happily. You should be smiling. You should never want to imply that you would rather be someplace else.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to get tired. Why are you complaining? This is the most important work on earth.
Exactly.
We're not paying you well for it, but we're still going to tell you it's super, super important.
And that's you've kind of identified there in a nutshell, the catch-22 that is the American educator. Yes. You're going to be devalued, but you're going to be overpraised. Not overpraised, but devalued, but yet hypervalued. It's and ultimately,
how do you make sense of that? How do you make sense of this fact that you're told this is the most important job on earth, but we're going to give you $35,000 a year for it? Yeah. How does that work?
I think the only way to really make sense of it is just to start to say, okay, this system the roots of this system is built on white supremacy and institutional sexism. So it's not going to make sense because there's nothing logical about devaluing, an entire group of people or 51% of the population because of gender or ethnicity traits. It's not logical by definition. And so part of it has to be, we're going to make sense of it, if we're going to make changes, we just have to start labeling patterns whenever we can and recognize this system was built for our comfort as white women, which means if I'm uber comfortable, odds are good someone in my world, be it a parent, be it a student with a disability, be it a child of color, somebody likely is uncomfortable, which isn't to say that we need to be uncomfortable, but we can't center our comfort. We can't make that the top of the to-do list, and again, it's that catch-22 of devalued and hypervalued at the same time.
So what are some things that we can do to sort of disrupt that? If we know that the system doesn't make sense because it was built on an inequity purposefully, and we know that we want to do better, what can teachers begin doing?
I think one of the first steps teachers can do, especially if teachers are white women, is become educated about institutional racism, is to start to think about white supremacy and how we inadvertently play into that. And there's so many great resources about that. Teaching Tolerance does a whole bunch of really great webinars. There's Robin DiAngelo's books. I mean, you've talked about it. There's a whole bunch of resources to turn to. Then is to start getting more comfortable with calling out and identifying patterns. I notice that. I wonder if. I notice that of our, like I said before, our 15 leadership positions in our school, 12 of them are staffed by male teachers, even though we only have 12 male teachers in our building. Just start to identify patterns. And the challenge will be, it's not about an individual man. That's one of the biggest challenges on Twitter I almost fell into a gender cliche there. I almost said, dudes get very sensitive on Twitter. But some dudes sometimes get very sensitive on Twitter. It's not about us as individuals. It's about systems. But as individuals, we can educate ourselves. We can work to understand why we do what we do. I'm also a big personal advocate myself of quotas, and just kind of keeping in mind, if I'm the things that I'm doing represent the world in which we live. So if you're looking at your classroom library, does your classroom library represent the world, or does it represent heterosexual, cisgender, non-disabled norm of white America? Or are you representing the full spectrum of the experience? When we think about the text that we use, are we centering people of color as opposed to, white Americans? And just thinking about how can we bring the margins into the center, and how can we ensure we're interrupting patterns wherever we can?
Right. And I think what makes it sort of tricky, especially for white women to notice and interrupt these patterns, is that we're just not taught to think systemically. We're not taught to notice these kinds of institutions and structural discrimination and that sort of thing. So we do tend to think of an individual. And so, if we're talking about how women are treated in schools, then, it's tempting to say, but I have a male principal and he's really nice to us and he works just as hard as we do. Or, if we're talking about how, the inequity is really based on white supremacy, then it's really easy to say, but I'm not racist. It's apart from me. And I think what you're talking about here, about not just thinking about individual people or making individuals right or wrong. This person is good or bad. This person is doing the right thing, or this person is, a bad person. I think sort of moving away from that, and let's look at systems. Let's look at things that we've been conditioned to believe. Let's look at the structures that are set up and notice how that plays out in these repeating patterns that you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And all we can do as individuals is not all we can do, but what we can do as individuals is think about how we can interrupt those patterns. That isn't to say we need to work to get the male principal fired because he's a male teacher. But it is to say, looking at the research around things of that nature, there's every single principal, one of the first things they can do is, if you have a faculty meeting and you ask for questions, if you open it up for questions to your teachers, always call on a woman first, if a woman has raised her hand, or a person of color, if a person of color has raised their hand first. There's been a couple of different studies that show that if someone from a woman or a person of color talks first, that you're more likely to hear questions from women, or you're more likely to have other people of color chime in. So in other words, as much as you can, don't call on a white man first, which sounds so kind of, wait a minute, but he might have a good point. I'm sure he does, but it has to do with our comfort level with following up and speaking up. So principals can start by thinking about the patterns when you call on people in terms of, faculty meetings or things of that nature, or when you highlight someone's work, thinking about patterns when we highlight.
I think the piece about speaking up, that's a whole nother kind of can of worms here, because, it is difficult. When we talk about teachers wanting to advocate for themselves, sometimes it is different from, if a woman speaks up than if a man speaks up. I shared a piece on my Facebook page the other day, and a former male teacher jumped in and said, when I was a teacher, I told the principal, I'm not doing this. And, teachers need to stand up and they need to kick and scream and say they're not going to tolerate this anymore. And I'm like, with respect, it's going to be perceived differently when it comes from you, because you're a white man. It's going to come across differently if it's a person of color or if it's a woman. And, when women are sort of conditioned that we need to be sweet, especially white women, we need to be sweet, we need to be nice, we need to prioritize the comfort of other people and their feelings. That's more important than being heard. That's more important than making our point. And so I think there's a big fear on the part of a lot of teachers that if I speak up, I'm going to be perceived as aggressive or defensive or fragile or emotional, and I'm not going to be taken seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're hitting upon that need for self-education. It's reading stuff like D'Angelo, who has a whole great chapter on white women's tears, on how there's learned behaviors that we pick up that in our attempt to avoid those learned behaviors, we may inadvertently reinforce those learned behaviors. So you've spoken to that need between, I have to unlearn behaviors and I have to learn new behaviors in order to kind of move us forward.
Right. And just to clarify for anyone who's sort of wondering, how does race really play into this? I think it may be a little easier to understand because it is a woman majority field, and early teachers were women. I think the influence of gender dynamics in the patriarchy is a little bit more obvious. And so I just want to kind of state explicitly and let you elaborate, because you're much more versed on this than I am. The patriarchy and white supremacy are inextricably linked. You cannot separate them. They work together. And so, we really can't talk about any of these issues without race also coming into play. Am I saying that? Do you think that's a fair way to say it?
I think that's a very fair way to say it. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to sing her praises one last time is Robin DiAngelo, who talks about Kimberly Crenshaw's work around intersectionality and how the nature for Black women, especially how they sit right at the crossroads of that white supremacy and institutional sexism in schools. And so there are experiences and there are I'm going to say intersections again, but there's intersections for our Black women teachers that is unique to their experiences and how those things come together that are worth us spending time thinking about. So I think you've hit upon a very important point that a Black woman may experience things differently as a teacher than a white woman would. And those differences are essential and important for us to attend to.
Is there anything else here that I haven't asked you about that you think is really important for teachers to understand?
I'm looking at my bookshelf. I'm like, can I tell them to read all these books? I think the thing we have to do is we have got to, if I could say, here's one thing, dear friends and listeners, if I could advocate for, is there are so many well-known white male educators in a profession that's dominated by women. That you can see, someone will say, here's 10 new great education books I can't wait to read. And every single book is written by a white guy. And it's not that the white guys don't have good things to say, but they're just everywhere. And it's one of those, if your gut is to say, hey, you should read this great book by well-known white male educator, I guarantee you, I can promise you, there is a book saying something, there's a book saying that main idea that's been authored by a woman of color, by a man of color, signal boost them. There's the same 6 to 10 men who keep getting bandied about in education, and they're not really saying anything new anymore. But yet they keep coming out with a new book that's a rehashing of the old stuff, and so they get elevated. Signal boost somebody else and stop talking about Finland. We're not going to solve our problems by adopting what Finland did. And so we could just stop with the Finland.
What do you think about the fact that when teachers do speak up for what they need, they have a fear of being perceived as being greedy or selfish or not putting kids first, particularly when it comes to public opinion? I mean, ultimately, it's the taxpayers who, anytime they see teachers, striking or rallying or speaking out, they're accused of being greedy. They feel like, oh, you barely work as it is and you just want more. How do we reconcile this idea that teachers actually really do need to stand up for themselves in many ways, and we do need to improve working conditions for teachers without this fear of, I don't care about kids, always being at the surface? Because I think that's what holds people back from speaking up. No one wants to be that person who doesn't care about kids.
And I think the easiest response is the short answer is to say you devoted your life to becoming a teacher. You made it your professional career. No one doubts your commitment to children. I don't think anyone actually goes into teaching for the summers off, as much as that cliche, is bandied about.
Never. I've never heard a teacher who said that ever.
And the funny thing is, if you do find someone like, oh yeah, I became a teacher because I could have summers off, probably a married guy, most likely white, whose wife is also a teacher. So, there's that stuff there, but don't be afraid to be greedy. If somebody says, well, you want this, what about the kids? What about the students? My working conditions are their learning environment. The fact that I have to go 4.5 hours without using a restroom because there's no way that impacts your child, that I have to, that I can't get the resources that I need. And so I have to either choose between, buying extras for my family or extras for my classroom. That impacts me as a teacher. So I'd say don't be afraid to be greedy. Don't be afraid to say what you need. But at the same time, ask yourself, is what I'm doing trying to center whiteness, femininity? Am I trying to get back to my comfort level, or am I truly trying to make a better environment for all students? And so it's a constant battle. There is no straight line. I think part of this work is constantly going back and forth about, am I inadvertently feeding stereotypes and completing patterns, or am I interrupting and centering the margins? Every situation is different, and we just have to keep asking that over and over again. And when we make mistakes, apologize and don't do it again.
Right. Keep moving forward. It's not this endless guilt trap, keep moving forward. When you know better, you do better.
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about, Angela, about the notion of punching up versus punching down, calling in, calling out. And I think that's something that we could have a conversation about as white women, as an educational world, about what it means for us to call in our fellow white women, what it means to call out white male leaders. When Black women call us in, our obligation to listen, regardless of how hard it is. I think that's another thing that's worth kind of thinking about and trying to unpack the best we can.
Right, because there's no way to do that and keep everyone comfortable.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times we prioritize that. Let's, say it in a way that makes me feel okay to hear it. And if I don't feel good hearing it, then you have done something wrong.
At the same time, sometimes it's hard to hear things. Sure. And so, if it's kind of funny, because if one of my friends says something to me, and even if it falls on me harsh, I understand where they're coming from. But if a stranger says, I think the point is, it's that constant battle. And the worst thing we can do is just kind of brush our hands of it all and say, well, I can't solve it, or it's not my responsibility. The best thing we can do is all lean into it and try to solve it.
Right. And also not fall into that martyr mentality where it's like, I work so hard as a teacher, and, everyone's always criticizing me all the time. I think that's one of the reasons why it's really easy to be fragile as an educator, because you're constantly sort of feeling under scrutiny. Your students are pushing back, parents are criticizing, your administrator may be pushing back on something. So and the public in general sometimes feels like they're against you. So it feels like you're on your own trying to navigate all these spaces. And now here's a fellow teacher coming along and also criticizing me. Like, I'm done. I'm just going to shut down.
Exactly. And the good thing is there's affinity groups out there. There are groups out there of white women teachers negotiating this. And so there are affinity groups that, all around the country, online, where you can connect with other people who are trying to negotiate those same sort of tensions. So there's never an excuse to give up. Mm-hmm. Don't give up.
It's a lifelong process.
Yes, that it is. That it is.
What's something that you wish every teacher who is listening to this remembers?
I said to Julie G, she's a teacher on Twitter. She asked for some advice for new teachers. And I think the thing I would like everyone to remember is that what I shared with Julie is that our profession has a history, and we have an obligation to know it. And that means interrupting damaging patterns when we can, and tip the moral arc whenever and wherever we can. So it's about small moves and self-work.
And you're referring to that quote about the moral arc of the universe leans towards justice.
Yeah.
Am I saying that right?
Yeah. And it does very, very slowly. And I think what we can do as individuals, though, is work to tip it. And even if it's as small of a move as looking at classroom libraries and which histories you're teaching and who you're centering, to the bigger stuff. But don't feel guilty about asking for more. Be careful for your centering. It's complicated, but it's worth it.
If you enjoyed this episode, check out the recommended resources in the show notes. There's a link to all the articles and further reading that Jen recommends. And of course, you can find her on Twitter at JENNBINIS. She's having these kinds of conversations on Twitter daily, so it's a great place to interact with her. Have a great week. You can do this. And remember, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it.